So I feel like from time to time, we need to have these real talk videos. And the one that I need to share with you today is about growing your podcast audience. So let's get right to it. Hey y'all, Crystal here today. So like I said in the beginning, like from time to time, I feel like we need to have a little tough love conversation. And the one that I want to talk about today is growing your podcast audience, because people ask me this all the time. As soon as they launch, like this is usually like step one. If you look at like how I help people, it's usually in phases. It's start, launch, and market. And once people have started, they're like, okay, I know how to do this. I got my content. I got all my things. I'm ready to go. Then they move into the launch phase. And they're like, okay, I got this. I know what I'm doing. I'm ready to go. They launch their podcast. And then it's immediately like, okay, I launched it. Now, how do I get 100,000 downloads? And it's like, okay, well, hang on. We missed a few steps in the process because it is a process. Most podcasters, and I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands of podcasters at this point in time, they want to know, how do I go from launching this thing to getting my first million downloads? And I gotta be really honest with you. At this point in my journey, I don't have 1 million downloads, okay? I mean, I would love to sit here and say, I have the #1 podcast and I have millions of downloads and thousands of listeners and I'm holier than thou, but that is not reality. That is not reality at all. Instead, what I want you to ask is, how can I serve the people that are already showing up for me every single week? That's actually what we're going to talk about today, because once you can serve those people really, really well, they're going to be likely to share it with other people that are just like them that would find your podcast very helpful. So I'm going to cover 3 E's of serving the crap out of your audience. So the first E that I have to share with you today is engagement. How are you engaging with your audience? How are you asking them, well, what did you think about this episode? Or what do you want to hear next? How are you bringing them into the conversation? Even if you have an entirely solo podcast and you never do interviews, you don't have like coaching calls and have people on the podcast, like you don't do anything like that. You just do solo episodes. How are you still getting feedback? Because if you're putting your content out there into the void and you're not having this like cyclical engagement with your audience, then why are you doing this in the first place? Are you just doing this to hear yourself talk? I know I don't. I'm creating my podcast. I'm creating this content here on this channel to help people. And so I think that engagement is important. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to ask like almost for validation for every single piece of content you put out. That would be like me putting out an Instagram post and then turning around and putting it out another one and say, what do you think about my last post? Did you think it was good? Should I made it better? Like, what should I do? I'm not telling you to do that, but I am suggesting that you like make this an intentional priority on your calendar. Even if it's just once a quarter, once a month, that you reach out to your audience and say, hey guys, I'm doing some content planning and I want to know, what are some of the other things that you want to hear on the podcast? Do you want me to talk about this? Or I saw that this episode was downloaded a whole bunch. Like, what did you love about that episode? How can I make it better? So having that feedback and that engagement can really create a show that your audience becomes obsessed with. And that's really what we're doing. I don't know if you know this. I wrote a book called Start a BINGE-WORTHY Podcast. You can find it in the video description below. But the intention behind that wasn't just to create a podcast. I could have called the book Start a Podcast, a step-by-step guide to creating a podcast. No. Start a binge-worthy podcast. That was the intention behind it, because I wanted people to become obsessed with my podcast. I wanted people to become obsessed with my students' podcast, where they look, whatever day that, let's say your podcast comes out on a Tuesday hits and they're like, where's my phone? Where's my phone? I have to go listen to this podcast. It's my favorite thing that I do every single Tuesday. I love listening to this show. This is the intention that really happens to really drive up engagement, and it helps people just really fall in love with your show. So that is the first E of serving your audience really well, is engagement. The second E of serving your audience really well is empathizing. Now, I know that this may not apply to all podcast topics that could ever be created, but I do think it's important to let your listeners know, like, hey, because of the engagement, right? Because of the first E, I know that you are struggling with this, or this question has come up a lot in our community. I think that we should address it. Or I know that, let's just take the pandemic, like this is a perfect example, is letting people know that you understand where they are right now in their journey, or what they're struggling with, maybe in their personal life, their professional life, maybe it's even in their financial life. Depending on what your podcast is about, is you can empathize with your listeners. Now, like I said, this may not apply to every single show out there, but it's probably going to apply to 90% of the shows out there, because you can empathize with your audience in many different ways. Here's another great example. I'm a mom. I have 3 boys, and I like to empathize with my listeners who are parents as well, because maybe they're struggling with their students or their kids going through online virtual school, or maybe they're struggling to keep up with the laundry. This is the one my empathers, my audience empathizes with me, because I always talk about how much laundry I have. We have a family of 5, and it's just, I can't keep up with it. If you have secrets, like, tell me in the comments below what your secrets are to keeping up with the laundry. But I think that it's important to empathize with your listeners because they connect with you on a deeper level. Whenever you take the time to really be intentional about empathizing with them and sharing stories and being vulnerable, it just helps you have this deeper connection. In going back to the engagement, they're more likely to reach out to you if they feel like you understand where they're coming from or what they're going through, or you can connect with them on that deeper level. So the second E of serving your audience better is empathizing. So I want you to tell me in the comments below, where are you in your podcast journey? Are you just getting started? Have you already launched your podcast? Or are you in the marketing phases? So put in the comments below, start, launch, or market, so I can kind of get an idea of who's watching this video today. Okay, let's get back to the video. And the third E that I have to share with you about serving your audience well is to entertain them. I know this may sound a little silly, but bear with me here, because maybe you're like, but Crystal, I have a serious podcast, or I have a business podcast, or I have this, I have that. Like, this may not apply to all podcasts, but I can tell you, whenever I can tell a podcast host, like a podcast I'm listening to is having fun, they are being entertaining, I cannot wait to listen to that podcast. I can't wait to share it with other people, and I cannot wait to tell someone about it. Like, I listened to a show recently that I found, and I couldn't wait to have a conversation with my husband afterwards because it was so funny. It was so entertaining. And even though I don't even think he cared, my husband he could care less about what I was listening to. I just was like giddy to tell him about it. I was like, this was so fun. I loved listening to this podcast, but it was entertaining. That's why. So if this applies to the content that you're sharing on your podcast, ask yourself, how can this be more entertaining? Maybe it means sharing deeper stories. Maybe it means sharing something funny. Maybe it means sharing something that you only share on your podcast. If you have multiple platforms, you have social media, you have an email list, you have a YouTube, you have all these other places, then could you share something just on your podcast? Like, that's the entertainment value of like, oh, you can't hear this anywhere else. And it also makes a great content teaser to be able to tell your audience like, oh, I shared something on the podcast that you can't get it anywhere else. And you got to go listen to it to hear the story that I told because it was hilarious or crazy or whatever it is. But having that entertainment value can absolutely boost the engagement and the empathizing that you are doing with your current podcast listeners. So those are the 3 E's for serving the crap out of your current podcast listeners. I know you want to grow. I know you want to scale. I totally get it. But if you are only concentrating on growing and getting to that next level, then you're going to lose some of the people that are actually listening to your podcast right now. So make sure that you are serving the people that are showing up week after week to listen to your show right now, because I'm telling you, you could get a podcast listener for life by paying attention to those that are already following you right now. But that's all I have for you today. So make sure that you subscribe below and hit that thumbs up, hit that bell. That way you're notified anytime we put out a brand new video every single week. Make sure you check out these other videos right here, all about podcasting and running your online business. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.